Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our special Brisbane Writers Festival in the Burbs Logan event. Today it gives me great pleasure to welcome our presenter, Chris Cleave. A little bit about Chris before I hand over to him. Chris has recently released a new novel, Everyone Brave is Forgiven. It was an instant New York Times bestseller, and this book was such a great read for me. It was the settings in London and Malta and the colourful cast of characters that had me really hooked right from the start. Chris is no newcomer to writing. His debut, Incendiary, was an international bestseller and multiple prize winner. His second novel, again a New York Times #1 bestseller, was Little Bee, and it had phenomenal worldwide success. And I was saying to Chris before we started how much I loved this book, and I hope today that if you get a chance, go out and borrow a copy of Little Bee as well as this book we're talking about today. Chris has also had another novel, Gold, which confirmed his status as one of our most powerful, important and psychologically insightful novelists. Big words. So let's get it down to more the human face of Chris. I was interested to find out that Chris spent his childhood in West Africa, and something that you may not know about him is that he's also been a barman, a long-distance sailor, and I gather he can talk about sailing till the cows come home, a teacher of marine navigation, and an internet pioneer, which possibly is a bit dated these days. He lives in London with his wife and 3 children, but he has a secret passion and love for Australia. So Chris, on behalf of Logan City Council Libraries, welcome to the City of Logan and good morning.
Good morning. Thank you so much. Thank you for such a warm welcome, everyone. It's so nice to see so many people out first thing in the morning at the weekend. It's way beyond the call of duty. Thank you very much for coming. And thank you for that wonderful introduction.
Thanks, Chris. Chris, I thought to get started, you might like to let our audience, for those of you who may not have read the book, to tell people about the book and possibly do a reading.
Oh, I'd love to, yeah. So for people who aren't familiar with my novels, they all begin with a question. I'm not one of those writers that's great at thinking about what I want to say in advance. I don't plot my novels out. All I do is I think about a question that's really been bugging me in my life, and I wonder how I could use a novel to answer it. So for me, a novel is an inquiry that might take a couple of years of research and a couple of years of writing to get towards a question. The question in my first novel, Incendiary, is, can you really recover from a broken heart? So, all of us in this room will have had things happen to us, and you're just absolutely knocked over by them, and you think, well, how am I ever going to get up? How am I ever going to pick my life up again after this? So that was a question that was bothering me. I wrote from the point of view of a woman who had lost her son in a terrorist attack, and that's my first novel, Incendiary. The second novel, which you kindly referred to, called The Other Hand, is about refugees. And the question is, how much should we give up for people who are strangers to us? How much of our comfortable lives should we sacrifice in order to help people who are just like us, but have just been less lucky? And that took a long time for me as a writer to answer, and that became the novel The Other Hand. The third book, Gold, is about athletes. This question of work-life balance, this was the question that was bugging me at the time. What comes first, your family or your ambition? And that's something that nearly everyone is faced with. It's a very difficult and changing balancing act. When that question was bugging me, I thought that the people who could most help us to answer it were professional athletes, because no one's ambition is stronger than theirs. In fact, no one's job is darker than theirs, in a way. We're invited to celebrate athletes and think of them as the most noble amongst us. which they are, and I think they're incredible. But they're also some of the most evil people on the planet. Their job is to destroy everyone else's dreams in order to achieve theirs. And sometimes the person who they have to beat is their best friend. So if I wanted to ask the question, what comes first? Your friendships or your ambition? They were good people to help me answer the question. That's all my novels are. They start with an interesting question and they explore it, and they don't tell you the answer because I don't presume to have an answer to tell you. But what I do promise is that they will set up that question in a way that makes it fresh and intriguing and fascinating for you to think about in your own life. I began to think about what is bravery, what is courage, when I was talking with my grandfather, who, I guess we'll get on to later when we talk about, where the book comes from. He was the bravest man I've ever met. And I had this theory that maybe we're not all born brave. Maybe bravery is a muscle that develops through use. Maybe it's a habit of mind that we can get into. But I wanted to explore it. So that was my question. Where does courage come from? And in order to answer that question, I had to go back to a time when I could show a lot of people learning that habit of courage. And certainly in Australia and Canada and New Zealand, in the UK, if you go back to the Second World War, you find that on the home front and on the front line, lots of people went through this process of becoming brave. So this is where I went. I went back for the first time into history, into the Second World War, between 1939 and 1942, in London and in Malta. And Everyone Brave is Forgiven is the story of Mary North, loosely based on my maternal grandmother, who finds herself in London, assigned to teach children who cannot be evacuated from London at the beginning of the bombing, for reasons that I hope we'll get into as well. And that's the story. She starts out young, idealistic, full of bravado, but not yet of bravery, and we're about to watch the journey that she goes through. And we know, because we know what happened in the Second World War, we know before she does what's in store for her. What we don't know is how she is going to find a way to be herself whilst winning this battle that she needs to fight against the enemy, yes, but also against her own worst nature. So that's the book, Everyone Brave is Forgiven. And did you want me to read a little bit from it?
I'd love you to.
Right, I might just read you the opening to the book, and then it needs no preamble. War was declared at 11:15, and Mary North signed up at noon. She did it at lunch before telegrams came, in case her mother said no. She left finishing school unfinished. Skiing down from Montchoisy, she ditched her equipment at the foot of the slope and telegraphed the War Office from Lausanne. 19 hours later, she reached St. Pancras, in clouds of steam, still wearing her alpine sweater. The train's whistle screamed. London, then. It was a city in love with beginnings. She went straight to the War Office. The ink still smelled of salt on the map they issued her. She rushed across town to her assignment, desperate not to miss a minute of the war, but anxious in case she already had. As she ran through Trafalgar Square, waving for a taxi, the pigeons flew up before her, and their clacking wings were 1,000 knives tapped against claret glasses, praying silence. Any moment now it would start, this dreaded and wonderful thing, and could never be won without her. What was war, after all, but morale in helmets and trucks? And what was morale, if not 100 million little conversations, the sum of which might leave men brave enough to advance? The true heart of war was small talk, in which Mary was wonderfully expert. The morning matched her mood, without cloud or equivalence in memory. In London, under lucent skies, 10,000 young women were hurrying to their new positions, on orders from Whitehall, from chambers unknowable in the old marble heart of the beast. Mary joined gladly the great flow of the willing. Oh, thank you. You're very kind. Thanks.
Chris, you've mentioned that letters are the engine room of this book, how two people can fall in love through letters. And you write about the inspiration of your grandparents' letters to each other that helps with this novel. What was it like to actually read the letters?
This was the most extraordinary thing. I started to write the book, and I was basing it on my real grandmother, Mary, who was a teacher in London, in and around London, and on my grandfather, David, who was separated from her at the beginning of the war. He was sent to Malta, where he was besieged for 3 years, and they communicated by letter, and I was trying to imagine this set up. And I was wishing that I had some of the letters that they had sent to each other. Mm. And my mother said, "Oh, you mean these things?" And she presented me with this wicker box, a hamper, full of 1,000 pages of letters between my grandparents. It was the most extraordinary thing. So a lot of them were written on that very flimsy, blue aerogram paper, written tiny. The handwriting was minute because they needed to save every sheet of paper, and especially the letters that were sent from Malta to London had to be flown out, and the soldiers were allowed one sheet of paper each, and so they're written across and then they're written along. You've seen this, and it's it was beautiful to watch this relationship between the two of them develop. At the beginning of the war, they're very young. They're 18 and 19 years old, and they're writing these love letters to each other, which are charming and clumsy in the way that, post-adolescent love letters are. They sometimes really quite cringeworthy in a very charming way. And you see these people, my grandparents, who I love dearly and have respected as elders. It's so weird to see them younger than you suddenly. And it really brings it home, that, gosh, as well as being wise elders, they're people, guess what? And they make mistakes. It's really fun watching them make mistakes and misinterpret each other in their letters and in their replies. And you see this wonderful joy that they have, this incredible humanity, this sense of humour that is preserved really well in the letters. You realise they were people just like us. They were young, they were falling in love, and suddenly separated by the war, and suddenly realise in this separation that they know each other less well than they thought they did. Right? And so they're revealing more and more to each other. They're quite surprised. It's wonderful. These letters are very personal, very intimate, and never designed to be read by a third party. Very personal. So I went into it with this feeling that I was, really treading on hallowed ground and wanted to tread lightly, but wanted to understand everything. One of the fascinating things is when their separation begins, we start to lose the letters from her to him. So all of his letters to her have been very well preserved because she kept them. Every single letter that arrived in London, she would keep it, she would read it, she filed it, and she kept in a separate diary a record of when that letter had been posted, when it had arrived, its rough content, and what it had made her feel. And as a novelist, that was an extraordinary thing because it brought home to me the different way in which people communicated in those days. Now we have Facebook, we have email, we have everything, and we've got used to this, I guess, in our relationships, a kind of constant drip feed of reassurance. We have this, high frequency, low intensity communication with each other, whereas for them it was just the opposite. Maybe once a week they would get a letter through, once a month if the fighting was bad and planes couldn't leave the island of Malta. So they had this very low frequency, extremely high intensity communication. My goodness, it made them feel something when a letter arrived. And I don't know, how often you receive a letter in the mail these days, from someone who means a lot to you. For me, it's a rare thing that someone sends a letter now, but when they do, it's the most extraordinary thing. I mean, for a start, your name is written in their handwriting on the envelope just for you, and that's actually an extraordinarily personal and intimate thing. And you open the letter, and that's, again, it's just for you. It's this little moment in time that's travelled through space, and there you are with that other person. And if the letter maybe smells of them, it's extraordinary. If the content of it is meaningful to you, it's extraordinary. And if they can make you laugh in the letter, it's as if you're right there with them. That's the experience itself. Well, these were wonderful letters, and they'd clearly moved my grandmother enormously. She'd kept this diary of when they'd all arrived and how they'd made her feel. On the other hand, he kept all of her letters to him as well when he was under siege on the island of Malta. But at the end of the siege, when they were finally liberated as an island and he could travel back on a troop ship to the UK, he travelled on a different ship to his personal effects. So his trunk went on a different boat, and that boat was sunk by a German U-boat. So all of her letters to him, written during the siege, are at the bottom of the Mediterranean. They're still there somewhere in a box, maybe still readable. Maybe in 100 years someone will do a deep dive and bring them up, and then they'll be. I dream about it. All I have to go on is his responses to those letters, in his letters to her, which are preserved. And so I had to fill in the gaps, and it's out of becoming quite obsessed with filling in the gaps that the character of Mary North in the novel started to grow. She's the ghost in my family history, if you like.
In one of the letters that Mary writes, the character Mary, she says, "I was brought up to believe that everyone brave is forgiven, but in wartime courage is cheap and clemency out of season." And I know that you mentioned at the introduction about the question of bravery. Could you give us some more information, just to tease that one out?
In the novel, Mary, she's young and she's idealistic, and when she's assigned to teaching this class of children in London, she realises the reason a lot of these kids can't be evacuated from London is that the countryside doesn't want them. To sort of recap the evacuation from London, it was well organised. All of the children were taken out to the countryside, no problem, on trains, buses, automobiles. When they arrived in the countryside, it was much less organised. So they were typically lined up in their classes, in church halls, in village squares, and the locals were allowed to pick the kids that they liked the look of. It was a beauty contest. And so that was pretty tough if you were, for example, in a wheelchair because you'd had polio, right, which was actually pretty typical in those days. There were a lot of kids, with wonky legs or in wheelchairs from polio, which was no use to people in the countryside who needed those kids to help at some point with the harvest, for example. If you were from an ethnic minority, good luck, because the countryside at that point was not particularly receptive to that. If you just looked wrong, if your face didn't fit, you were unlikely to be picked. And so lots of these kids were left till last, moved from village to village, and a lot of them, nothing stuck, and they were moved back to London. And so the kids, the 20% of children who remained in London were disproportionately from ethnic minorities, or they had various disabilities. And that was the class that Mary North had to teach in this novel. And she discovers that she loves them. And she discovers, much to her surprise, having volunteered for war work. You saw the beginning of the novel, she's rushing back from her very aristocratic finishing school, imagining that she's going to be assigned to be a spy or an attaché to a general staff. Well, she's assigned to what she thinks is this very humble position as a teacher. And she's very displeased at the beginning. But then she discovers a vocation for it. She discovers, as many people do who spend time teaching, that she can't think of anything more important to do. And this puts her into conflict with her own mother. Right? Her mother is from a family of parliamentarians. They're very much on the right of British politics. And Mary finds herself in this position of being, pretty idealistic, pretty progressive, and championing these children, especially the children from ethnic minorities in London, who are extremely disapproved of by her own mother. So Mary's vocation, which she discovers because of the war, the war did this thing of putting people into jobs that they would never normally have done. A lot of them discovered that they liked it. Right? Mary discovers that she likes teaching. Mary discovers that she meets this young black child called Zachary. Well, they take a liking to each other. This is the first black person that Mary has ever met. And her mother strongly disapproves. And this puts her into conflict with her mother. And Mary, during a conversation with her mother, points out that previously, throughout her childhood, it was considered in her family to be a good thing to stand up for your principles. And that's where the line comes from that you mentioned. She says to her mother, I had thought in this family that everyone brave was forgiven. And yet, she realizes that she might have crossed a line that her mother won't forgive her for. She says, yet I see that in wartime courage is cheap and clemency out of season. And she realizes that perhaps the war has done more than put her into a job that she didn't think that she would enjoy. Maybe it has started to open up a generational gap between her and her mother that might never be closed up again. And that's a big theme of the novel. It's the fact that it's not just the way people endured the war, but it's the changes that the war wrought in society, in all of the Allied countries that fought that war. We didn't just win a war, we changed ourselves through doing it.
Chris, you've also said that there are two wars we have to win. One of them is against the enemy, but the other against the tendency of our own society to divide, to polarise and to fracture. And I'm sure that's not just for World War II. It's for all of the wars that even in this modern context that we'd be looking at. Do you want to elaborate further on that?
Yeah, sure. It's true in wartime. It's true also in peacetime. I'm writing historical fiction in this case, but in all of my books, I'm writing about now. Every novel is about the writer trying to answer a question about the time that they're living in. I am writing in the UK at the moment. I'm based in London, and we're living in a time of extraordinary and unprecedented societal division. It's a terrible, terrible time in the UK at the moment. It's an extremely divided nation. It's a nation that doesn't know what it is at the moment. And I have to go back to the Second World War to find a time when British society was prepared to put aside its differences in order to prosecute a common goal. I'm looking at what was it that brought us together. When I toured this book in America, I also find a deep fragmentation in that society. You know, the questions that people come up with in the Q&A at the end of talking about this book reveal a deep anxiety about whether that country will ever come together again as one unified people after the election they're about to have in November. After touring the book here for a week, you know, it's early days. I have to say, this feels like a great country to be. It feels like a more confident and a more a country where there's a kind of solidarity, a kind of common sense that might enable people to pull together in the face of these kind of existential challenges. I know you can answer this question much better than I can, but I think it is the challenge of our age, right, of this generation, to work out what it is that makes us us. And I think it's a question that is more urgent than I had realised maybe a year ago. You know, I was in this quite complacent position when I was writing this book of thinking I was writing about some eternal and timeless unity that people in Western societies naturally had. And my bubble was very much burst in June in Britain when this very divisive referendum revealed two completely different Britons, one of which I hadn't really suspected the existence of. So, I think that's where I'm coming from when I talk about the battle that we have to fight, yes, against the enemy, in wartime and in peacetime, against the existential threat, but the second battle that we all have to win in our own lives against our tendency to judge each other, our tendency to create divisions between us and other people with whom actually we have a lot of common cause.
We might keep going with forgiveness in that case on a national level. So you've mentioned that you wanted the reader to come away from this book wondering a number of things, considering again with the wars we fight now, to which the commitment of most of us is impersonal, and with an assumption that we shall never be reconciled with the enemy. Whether forgiveness is possible at a national level or whether it is only achievable between courageous individuals.
I think a lot about forgiveness. You know, the book's about courage and forgiveness, and forgiveness is incredibly underrated. It's the ability that allows us to move on from anger, and anger is perhaps the definitional emotion of our times, I think. People are very quick to be angry now, quicker than I can ever remember. People take offence instantly over anything and find it really hard to back down from the position that they establish. Forgiveness is really good, because it helps us to move on. If we can forgive each other, then we can find common cause. And I think that one of the things that's made us angry as a society is our attitude to other societies. And I'm not speaking about Australia specifically here, because I think Australia's trodden a perhaps wiser path through the last 15 years of geopolitics. But certainly in the UK, we've become involved in a lot of foreign wars, which have become generational struggles. They don't end with the capture of territory and the declaration of defeat or victory. They end with a calendar drawdown date and the fact, we've done a bit of very angry fighting now, and now we're going to leave, because now we're going to leave. No reason to start, no reason to stop. It's just anger, and that's created this kind of national feeling that it's possible to stay angry, that the anger in itself is somehow generational and righteous, and that there is no reconciliation possible with the enemy, ever. And that's a very bad kind of conflict to have at a national level, and I think it rubs off on us at a personal level. I think it's not the only, but one of the major contributing factors to the kind of insipid and endemic anger that you find at the moment, for example, in the UK, and which leads to these terrible societal divisions. So yeah, the book's about forgiveness, and it asks very pointedly this question of, where does it begin? Does it begin at the national level, or does it begin between ourselves? And again, you in your lives will have a personal and a better answer than I do to that. But I hope to tee up the question in a way that makes it interesting. I think something you can do in a novel is you have time that they don't have in a 3-minute news segment on TV, and you have space that they don't have in a 650-word newspaper piece, to create an environment where you, as the reader, can come in and bring your own rich life, and all of your experience to it, and answer a question for yourself in a space that's curated, where the question is set up in a way that I hope is really engaging. I've never felt that, that novels should be a punishment. I felt that they should be fun to read, and I feel that current affairs shouldn't be the exclusive domain of journalists and politicians. I think we as readers, we as writers, we as artists have a right to examine them and ask those questions for ourselves. And so that's why I'm teeing up this question of forgiveness and asking where it comes from and why is it so important right now.
Thank you, Chris. Humour. So, as you said, humour's it's so important, and the humour is in this particular book. In Little B, the humour's just is incredible. We know that humour, even with our own Australian soldiers in World War II, lots of reports. I think across the cultures, humour is what can save us. But I thought I'd ask, for me, I just felt it was so real reading your books. Do you hear the voices of these characters in your head and just go, yep, that's what they'd say to this situation? How do you do that?
I do a lot of research. I'm a big believer in researching a book so deeply that you don't need to show people that you've researched it. You want to do so much research that you can actually paradoxically wear it very lightly. And so rather than doing a lot of exposition and telling you what's happening here and here, I hope that my research comes out and just in the way the characters speak and in the decisions they make. And I spent an enormous amount of time. I have a friend at the BBC who went down into the deep, dark archives for me and digitized a lot of archival recordings of people just talking, in 1938, 39, 40, 41. So I could get the speech patterns right. So I could listen to their sense of humour, which I also had from talking to my grandparents and reading their letters. I made sure that I only, for a couple of years, I only read novels and newspapers and magazines that my characters would have been able to read in 1939. I only listened to music that they could have listened to then, which I really would recommend. It's not just the sort of crooners that we're all familiar with. They also had amazing dance music, big dance hall tunes that were extraordinary. Something I wouldn't recommend is eating the food that they ate. I went on to World War II rations for a while, which was extremely unpleasant. They, for a start, they're very restricted and also incredibly tedious. You're eating, 2.5 ounces of lard, 4 ounces of heavy margarine, a little bit of flour. A lot of tea every week. I was actually surprised by how much tea you were allowed, about how much jam you weren't allowed, and that kind. So I tried to get myself as far as possible into the life, into the mindset of people who lived then. And I've always done that with my books. I do this kind of method acting research. I loved their sense of humour. I discovered that they were properly funny, and this is something that I think the war movies and a lot of the war novels, they haven't done justice to that generation. They weren't brave because they were following orders. They were brave because they loved each other and wanted to help each other. And the reason they loved and wanted to help each other was because they made each other laugh all the time. They were really cohesive as a generation because they were funny. They weren't these clipped, stiff upper lip people that you see in the black and white movies. I'm terribly sorry. I seem to have lost a leg, but I'm still all there. Don't worry about me. They weren't like that. They were hilarious, and they were frightened a lot of the time, and that fear made them funny. It's our only defence when we've got nothing else left. You can still laugh. I loved them for that, and in fact, when I'd finished writing the book, I really missed them. I really missed the novels and the music and the radio shows. Gosh, I listened to the light entertainment programme on BBC from 1939 and 1940 for months. That was the only radio I listened to. And it was weird, like coming back kicking and screaming into the 21st century at the end of this book. It was like, they sometimes dredge up like a fish from the deep sea, and it comes up, and it's unfortunately like all sort of popped and distorted and changed by the time it gets. I felt like that. I felt like I'd been dredged up from the deep ocean, and I wanted to go back down. I really missed the way people spoke in 1940. I really missed their sense of humour. I really missed a kind of gentleness that they had, and a compassion for each other.
You mentioned reading other novels that have also concentrated on World War II. Have any of the novels that have recently been put out, have they really struck a chord with you?
Yeah, Kate Atkinson's really good. Many of you will have read Life After Life. Yeah. She's amazing. New one's just come out by Natasha Walter, who you might know from her non-fiction. She's an amazing feminist non-fiction writer, and also an advocate for refugees. And she's just written her first novel, which is called A Quiet Life. Fascinating, beautifully researched about World War II, about a spy. And because she's a woman, no one takes her seriously. It turns out to be the perfect cover in 1940. And she has this big life that she lives very quietly, and she's the only one who knows what's going on. It's beautifully written. And again, I think we're of a generation now where if you're telling a story about World War II, it had better be an original one that hasn't been told before. So my theme is about race and class divisions, generational gaps. Her theme is a feminist one. It's really good. Anthony Doerr, All the Light We Cannot See. This is good. Yeah. And I think it's no accident that there is this raft of really good World War II novels coming out at the moment. It's not like we all got together 5 years ago at a writers' conference and said, do you know what, we're all going to write World War II novels. It's entirely coincidental that they've all been written over the last 5 years and published now, because I think a novel has a sort of focal length in history. You can you want the events to be far enough away so that you can be objective about them. I can now write a novel about World War II that doesn't need to be nationalistic. It doesn't need to remind people that we beat the enemy. It doesn't need to concentrate on some notion of our greatness as the Allied nations. It can talk about the human story now. We're far enough away so I can talk about what makes us human rather than what made us victorious. That's an important distinction. And at the same time, the events are not so distant that they've become historical. It's not archive stuff. This is family stuff. This is my grandparents who I grew up with, and the mystery of why they were so gentle, having been so strong during the war. So I think we've reached a very good point in history from which to write about World War II. It's close enough to still feel intimate, and far enough away so that we have a certain measure of objectivity. And I think, well, that's my guess as to why we have, maybe even this year, five really good novels about World War II haven't come out, whereas for the last 10 years there were very few.
Chris, with that method acting, I'm just thinking of the siege of Malta, and the descriptions of that siege were just, again, fantastic. Well, how did you research that side of the story?
Malta was amazing. I went to the island, and this is the part of my job that doesn't feel like work. Has anyone been to Malta? It's lovely, isn't it? It's a tiny island, I guess if you had to draw a ring around Brisbane, that's the size of the whole of Malta and the whole island, and you can walk across it in a day. And I went there for a couple of months, and I just explored everywhere on foot. I went to all of the places that my grandfather had been stationed there. So he was in the Royal Artillery. So wherever he went, there are these great big concrete bases that they poured to put their artillery pieces on, and the concrete plinths are absolutely indestructible. So they're still there. And so even if you had to fight through undergrowth and brambles and thorns to get there, you knew you were in exactly the right place, and I could stand there and know that I was seeing exactly what my grandfather and his men had seen. And it was very moving. I stayed in all of those places. I talked to whoever wanted to talk to me about their experiences during the war. I talked to older people. A lot of them had been children during the siege. And it was really interesting. As a novelist, you have no agenda. You don't want anything from people apart from their stories if they want to share. And it's pretty unusual, I think, in life for someone to stroll up to you and said, would you like to talk about your life? And people do. People are quite pleased to talk about it. And often it's quite emotional for them because they won't really have talked about these experiences. No one ever asks. I keep getting this sort of, all through this tour, people have said, that generation never talked about their experiences in the war. It's like, well, have you ever asked? And have you ever given them, permission to talk? A lot of those people who lived through it, it's out of pure politeness and a sensitivity for other people's feelings that they haven't spent the last 70 years talking about it. But actually, there's a lot that they want to talk about. And this was interesting. This was great, talking with people who'd been through the siege. And I guess this is what I mean when I say that this is almost the last chance to write in that way about World War II while we still have living witnesses. You can ask them and they'll tell you not what the great thrust of this battle or that military stratagem was, but what it felt like on any given Saturday morning at 10:30. What were they doing for fun, or what were they afraid of, or what were they eating? Like these small details of life that make the novel real. I spent a lot of time on the island. I went to all of the military graveyards where, my grandfather's friends were buried, and I could see, in his letters, in his handwriting, the names of the people who had died, and then I could go and find them. The Commonwealth War Graves Commission will help you to locate a grave, and it was very moving, seeing, this is real, this really happened, here are all these people. And I think, well, look, I'm a great believer in doing your research in real life rather than on the internet, because I think then a sense of place, a sense of history kind of seeps into you and hopefully then back out onto the page.
Chris, any chances this book will be made into a film, or...?
Yeah, I'm hopeful. I'm always hopeful. I'm one of my books, the first one, Incendiary, has been made into a movie. The second one is like the long story of will they make it, won't they make it. The third one, Gold, is being made at the moment. This is it's probably the most visual of all of my books. It's set in a velodrome. And we've got some actors literally training at the moment. for that, and that's going to be really good. This one, I don't see this one as a movie. You know, this is a very long novel with a lot of substance and a kind of natural rhythm to it, and I think it's going to be a TV series. So yeah, I see it as that. And
That's
also,
made everyone happy.
yeah, I'm writing a sequel to it at the moment, so I guess there's a kind of series 2 as well. And I actually really admire what TV is doing now. I think a series, you know, that's maybe a 6-parter or an 8-parter on TV does something very similar to what the novel was originally designed to do. I mean, let's not forget that novels haven't existed forever. You know, it's only the last really, 150 years in their current form. And what they're great at is, you know, you read a chapter or two, I don't know, maybe in the evening, and then you sleep on it, you know, and you kind of wake up caring more about the characters than you did the day before. You know, they grow on you, and it's in the absence from the characters that you think a little bit about them, that you bring your own life to the book. You know, the reader does half of the work in a novel. You know, you meet the writer halfway, and you have space to do that in a novel. And I think TV series are really good for that too. You watch an episode, you walk away, a kind of curiosity grows, the character grows into the spaces that you leave for them. And so I think that the novel and the TV series are more sort of natural bedfellows than the novel and the movie.
Fantastic. So we've hopefully got a sequel. Have we got anything else on the wings at the moment?
I'm writing a kids' book. Yeah. Yes. So my ones are my ones are 7, 10, and 13 at the moment, and I promised them. You know, I've been putting it off for years, but they made me promise to write them one, and I'm secretly enjoying it more than anything else I've ever done. So yeah, that's a project. I don't know if it'll be any good. You know, I'm way out of my comfort zone with it. It turns out to be a lot harder than it looks, writing a children's book. So I don't know. I don't know if it'll be good, but I'm enjoying doing it.
Okay, my last question before we hand over to the audience is, what's your favourite book at the moment? And do you have an author or book that has influenced you that you keep returning to?
Brilliant questions. Thank you. Thanks for all of them, by the way.
Thank you.
Thanks for preparing this whole interview so well. I really appreciate it. And thanks. Favourite book that I'm reading at the moment? Oh yeah, I'm reading a book by Lucia Berlin. Has anyone read Lucia Berlin? Right, so she was completely new to me as of 1 month ago. However, she's a very well-respected writer in America, it turns out, and has been known there for a long time, but I discovered her quite by accident. So she writes, or wrote, she's dead now, she wrote stories, short stories, loosely based and sometimes very closely based on her own itinerant life. So she moved around all over America and the southern parts of America and the Mexican border and Mexico, had several husbands, some children, a complicated relationship with booze, and writes with the most extraordinary insight into what lives are like, you know, how many hidden rooms there are behind the face that you show to the world. She's had a really hard life, but the book is not depressing. It's not bitter. She writes with extraordinary empathy. She does something that only the best writers, I think, do, which is, you know, they make room in your own heart for the story to live in, you know, and you end up made bigger by reading it. So the collection that I'm reading at the moment is called A Manual for Cleaning Women. One of the jobs she had was she was a cleaning woman, and she reproduces the instructions that the homeowners gave to her. And you know, it's this wonderful spectacle of that. She happened to be poor at the time and they happened to be rich, but my goodness, she was operating at an intellectual wattage much higher than that of the people who were giving her these very fussy instructions. It's wonderfully done, really well observed. Lucia Berlin, she's called, and it's the I mean, it's affected me more than anything I've read for years. And then you asked about, over the long term, who's been most influential on me? Virginia Woolf. I like her bravery. You know, she wasn't afraid to really push the boat out and go for a big architecture, right? So, yeah, got some fans here, yeah. So the architecture of the novels, the scope, the ambition, the fact that she lands it, you know, she has the technical ability to match her ambition. And then the sheer beauty of the language, so beautiful. You know, she won't say that, you know, Big Ben struck. She'll say that the bells sounded and the leaden circles dissolved in the air. You know, everything's much more beautiful than it needed to be. But beauty is not the point of it. It's just, you know, the point of it are these great structures. You know, extraordinarily clever writer. And Virginia Woolf.
Chris, on behalf of Logan City Council Libraries, I'd like to thank you for joining us today. Can I also thank our audience and everyone that we have here? Can I point out too that we have a second Brisbane Writers Festival event happening today at Logan Hyperdome Library. It's Canadian author Kate Pullinger. She'll be talking about the intersection of narrative and new technologies and how that is shaping what and how we read. There are some fabulous global perspectives in Kate's new novel Landing Gear, which she'll be sharing with us. Again, thank you for joining us for this special Brisbane Writers Festival in the Burbs Logan event. Thank you.